Okay, well, hi and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this launch of our latest issue of the NACLA Report Against Forgetting, all about historical memory and reckonings in Latin America and the Caribbean. My name is Heather Gies. I'm managing editor of the NACLA Report. And for anyone who may be new to our work, NACLA, which is the North American Congress on Latin America, was founded in 1967 following the US invasion of the Dominican Republic to provide anti-imperialist news and information on what was happening in the region. And it's remained a source of research and reporting on the region and US relations with the region for more than 50 years. So if you're not following our work already, you can do so on our website, nacla.org. And I would also encourage you to subscribe to the NACLA Report, which is our quarterly print magazine where we take a deeper dive into these issues. Just to give you a bit of a preview of some things we have in the works for the NACLA Report coming up later this year, we have an issue coming out in the fall on Blackness and indigeneity in the Americas. And then later in the year, our winter issue will look at the state of media and journalism in the hemisphere. So stay tuned for those. If you're interested in getting your hands on a copy of this issue and you're not a subscriber, we do have limited issues available for individual sale. The cost is $15. So if you're interested in that, you can contact us. Our email is info@nacla.org. You can also find that email on our website, and we can try to make that happen. So I wanted to say thank you to all of our contributors who are joining us today, but also to the other contributors and interviewees who are part of this issue. I learned so much from working with all of you and all of the rest of the folks. And I'm really grateful to be able to share this work and continue the conversation here today. So for our event today, we'll start with a conversation between the participants here, who I'll introduce very shortly. And after about an hour, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So please do send us your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We have the chat on the right-hand side, and we do encourage you to chat there, but use the Q&A function, please, for your questions so we can find them. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and introduce the speakers, and I'll share more in the chat as well so you can find their work from this issue. Carlos Juarez is a lawyer at the Grupo de Apoyo Mutuo, or GAM, in Guatemala, and co-coordinator of the GAM Historical Archive. And in this issue, he co-authored a piece on the project to digitize those archives and the partnership behind that effort. Jillian Matthews teaches history at the University of the West Indies. She's a recipient of the UWI Guardian Life Premium Teaching Award and has published multiple books on history of the Caribbean and Trinidad and Tobago. And she wrote a piece on renaming a residence hall at the University of the West Indies that had been named after a racist British colonial administrator, and kind of the broader campaign for reconciliation and reparations. John Gibler is a journalist and author of the books I Couldn't Even Imagine That They Would Kill Us, which is on the disappearance of the Ayotzinapa students, and Torn from the World. He wrote a piece on the disappearance and the ongoing disappearance of the 43 Ayotzinapa students in Mexico. And Manuela Badilla is a postdoctoral researcher in the sociology department at the University of Valparaiso, Chile, and a researcher at the Millennium Nucleus of Art, Performativity, and Activism, also in Chile. She wrote about memory in the historic protests that erupted in Chile in 2019. And last but not least, our moderator is Greg Grandin. Greg is professor of history at Yale University, and he's the author of multiple books, including the Pulitzer Prize winning The End of the Myth. Greg is also a longtime NACLista and former executive editor of the NACLA Report as well. So thank you all so much for being here. And with that, Greg, I'll hand it over to you to start our discussion.
Well, thank you, Heather, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this. It's really a great issue. I mean, the individual essays are terrific, and as an issue, it hangs together really well. And I thought the essays spoke to each other, especially the ones that are represented here with the authors. I thought maybe we could just get going I mean, my understanding of it is that we have about an hour to discuss among ourselves, and then we can open it up for a half an hour for questions. We can maybe give and take that a little bit. I just wanted to say that what I was struck by, I haven't really thought too much recently about in terms of methodology, about the relationship between history and memory. But I remember there used to be, back when, back in the day, whenever memory became a concern of historians, a lot of conceptual heavy breathing about which was what and what was which, and what the difference is between history and what the difference is between memory. And I reading these pieces, I just feel like that distinction has just been, in many ways, blown away. It's clear that the kind of memory work done on the front line of activists trying to hold power accountable, just as a generic way of describing what's going on in all of these pieces, is really where vital historiography is taking place. This is history. I really don't see any distinction between the two, and it just called me back to an earlier moment of it within the discipline of history, when there was a lot of effort to distinguish the two and theorize the two. But I also obviously think that this is important because Latin America historical memory has been remarkable. Especially Chile. I mean, maybe we can talk about this when we speak about Manuela's piece. It's just remarkable. And when I teach in students, undergraduates, and one of the things I emphasize is, if they could possibly imagine, these are progressive students that have seen their share of demonstrations and they're politically active, but if they could imagine going to protests in which the protests are framed around events that happened 40 years ago or 50 years ago, and here I'm obviously thinking of Chile, or the way that 73, the way that Keynes and Friedman and Pinochet still frame the historical debate, and how it's such a kind of living and vital way of thinking about politics. I mean, I think that's true about all of Latin America. I often say that that Latin America never forgets, the United States never remembers. That's basically the essence of of America in the broad sense of the word exceptionalism. There's this kind of, but there is distinctions between countries, and maybe that's something also we could talk about. And I think maybe that comes out in the distinction between Guatemala and Chile, where it seems like the historical memory is in Chile is an organic kind of I don't want to downplay the work that's done, but it runs deep. Where in a place like Guatemala, where I know more intimately the work to kind of people who are politicized, and people who are organized, and people who are involved in the movement, obviously will begin any discussion about whatever the current crisis is, situating the conjunction in the larger historical moment, and start with the conquest and move forward. But there does seem to be a kind of distinction in the way history is remembered and memory is mobilized. And
Greg, I think your sound cut out. Yeah, we can't hear you. No, we can't hear you right now. Well, Greg, maybe you can try signing out and signing back in, and in the meantime, we can have one of our participants get started here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
That's my problem. Testing.
So I'm not exactly sure where Greg was planning to start, but he was just mentioning in a bit about Guatemala and really the struggles there to be able to remember and to keep this historical memory alive. So Carlos, you and your co-authors discussed this project of the Grupo de Apoyo Mutuo, the historical archives, and your project to digitize it in partnership with Haverford College. So could you tell us a bit more about that archive, the work to digitize it, and why this is so important, especially at this moment in Guatemala?
Thank you, Heather. I want to make sure that you can hear me because I thought that it was my connection with Greg. You all know Guatemala connection is not that good, but this time it wasn't me. So I want to thank you, everybody. I feel really excited to be here to be part of this beautiful event and to share with all of you that I consider memory warriors, because no one believes in this kind of work around the world, and we are doing our best efforts to keep the memory alive of the victims of the internal armed conflict, specifically in Guatemala. I had to say, first of all, also thank you to Brie Gerelson, my colleague in Haverford, that made possible all this effort with this piece with you, and all the effort around the archive, and my colleague in Guatemala, Daniel Alvarado. We are facing a huge challenge rescuing these kind of documents. Why is important to do this job? Because there are some families that the only thing that they have from their disappeared relatives are the documents that are saved in the group mutual support group archive. So we are facing a reality that, if you consider the time of the period of the civil war in Guatemala, 1960 from 1996, the victims of 1960 are not going to have access to justice. The perpetrators are dying. They already died, so they are not going to be able to have access to justice. So what we are facing is this reality of giving dignity to the memory of the victims by taking these documents and putting online and give access to information to all the generations that are behind us, and they are learning about what happened in Guatemala. We are trying to making this struggle against forgetting, because there are really deeply efforts in the governments to forget what happened in Guatemala, and to make the people erase that part of the history from their heads. and the discussion is around we are in the Cold War again if we talk about these issues. So what we need to do is to make these efforts and these alliances that for us working with Haverford has been incredible. We think that we need to improve this experience in all Guatemala archives. There are really treasures in other organizations, in other groups that can be able to bring dignity to the families who still today are looking for their relatives. That's why for us it was really, really important to work with Haverford. And one of the things that I want to say, and for me is one of the precious things that we made possible with Haverford, is to center families in the to put families in the center of the project. We in all moment the ethics it was key to make this project successful. So I think that taking this job, taking this work, it's a duty that all of the generations that come behind us had to make to keep the memory of the people alive in Guatemala.
I'm just gonna take a second. Can you hear me now? Oh
Yes,
yeah.
Greg.
Oh, great.
Yes.
So sorry about that, whatever the reason that was. But maybe we should just continue then and have people present on what their essays are, and then we'll have a discussion amongst themselves. And I'll try to. And I don't know if while I was out, if you decided an order or not. But whoever, Manuela, do you want to?
Yeah, I would be happy. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can.
Fantastic. So, well, I have to take this opportunity to thank everyone to be here, and especially the NACLA, the NACLA Report of the America team and Heather for the patient and for working with us in this wonderful special issue. And of course, I also would like to thank Greg for comment on our papers and having this conversation with us. And of course, my colleagues which are here right now. So I would like to, maybe I would like to start by the end of my paper, which I think it was kind of an open question. Just a brief, maybe summary if you haven't read it yet. This is a paper about this recent, still ongoing, I will say, uprising in Chile that started in October 2019, and a present wave of social mobilization that, as we actually said in Chile, despertó this country, like awoke Chile and his historical memories, right? So it demonstrates the present relevance of the Chilean difficult past. And when I'm saying the difficult past, and this is one of the things that I really wanted to show in this brief essay, is that when we talk, or when we used to talk about memory in Chile, we used to talk about, the problems and the victims and the legacies of the military dictatorship that we had between 1973 and 1990, right? But what happened during this last year and a half with this huge social mobilization is that several layers of the past were somehow removed. Starting by very recent type of memory, meaning the memory of the contemporary repression that the protesters were suffering, and they automatically start building memorials and trying to recover that as a political tool, right? And at the same time, there were memories, for example, of the feminist movement in Chile that were very, in a very ubiquitous way, all around the cities, with performances, street art, among many other type of expressions. But also, and I think this is kind of, it was surprising for me at the beginning, we started to see a questioning of colonial memories, right? Which is something that in the southern corner is not kind of it's not in the public sphere. I don't know if you remember the recent comments of Presidente Fernandez in Argentina, right? Like that I mean, he said, right, we are coming from the boats and from Europe, basically. So I think that was one of the really interesting thing, right? This very intense crossover of different layers of the past within all these demonstrations, right? So, and when I just said that I would like to start by the end of the paper, is this because I try to describe, right, how these different memories were recovered and were used by the demonstrators, and different performances that we could see in different Chilean cities. But also one of the main demands of this protest or social movement, as I would like to call it, is a debate there. Also, we can discuss that. Is that we quickly started demanding a new constitution, right? To like replacing the constitution that we inherited from the military dictatorship. It was written in 1980. So at the beginning, it seemed something like very difficult to achieve, but it was really present in the streets, you know. So very quickly, one of the slogan was we need a new constitution, or we need to end the Pinochet's constitution. So yesterday, I mean, not yesterday, it was on Sunday, we have actually the inauguration of the new Constitutional Assembly in Chile, which is actually one of the, I would say, main achievements of this mobilization that, of course, was defined by the elites at the beginning as a problem of violence, vandalismo, like terrorism, all of these very common words that we were familiar to hear in the 80s also, when, you know, the elites referring to the, you know, left-wing organizations and parties. So it was very incredible to see the conformation of this new assembly. And I wanted to share just one picture with you, because I think that kind of give us a very, you know, deep image of what I'm trying to say here. This is Elisa Loncon, the president. She just was elected president of the Constitutional Assembly on Sunday, and she's a Mapuche woman. She's a professor at the University of Santiago. She has a PhD in linguistics, and seeing her at that moment in Chile after all these mobilizations, and as I try to put in the front, right, of memory and the importance of the past in front of this Constitutional Assembly, and saying this type of things, it was just a sort of demonstration or a proof, you know, of the key relevance of the past for our nations, right, for our region. And she said this, right? I'm grateful for the support of the different coalitions that place their trust and their dreams in the hands of Mapuche Nation, main indigenous group in Chile, who voted for a Mapuche person, a woman, to change the history of this country. So the power of those words, I think, make us think in probably several of the phenomena that we are studying here in this special issue, right? So how different forms of past oppressions, different temporalities also, right? Recent, midterm and long-term temporalities kind of bring to the present as a way of fighting, right? As a way of struggling for social justice.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I would like to leave it there because I have too many things to say and I don't want to use the floor.
Yeah, we have a little bit of time. Maybe John, and then Galen, how do you say it? I'm sorry, how do you pronounce your first name?
Jaline.
Jaline.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Same here.
I don't know, maybe John and then Jaline can just quickly just sum up, what the paper, what your essay was about, and then we can open it up for discussion.
Sure thing. First off, just to make sure, is the sound working?
Yep.
Okay,
For me, it is.
Thanks as well. Thank you very much to Heather and everyone at NACLA for all the work on this issue. Thanks, Greg, for joining us. And of course, all the other panelists with their excellent essays, and looking forward to the conversation and to hearing more from everyone. Very quickly, I wrote about the struggle for memory in the case of the mass forced disappearance of 43 college students from the rural, partly indigenous teachers college in Ayotzinapa, Guerrero. And memory work in this case took place and continues to take place at the same time as the various levels of struggle to locate the 43 disappeared, to fight against the continuation of other atrocities carried out by the state in the process of continuing to disappear the 43 students. That memory work, because this is something that's still happening right now, it's been going on for almost 7 years, is taking place at the same time as all the levels of struggle, which of course probably happens in most of these contexts. And I look into briefly the way in which the Mexican state, under now 2 very different administrations, has used the structure of the state to disappear the students. So I'll talk about 2 different stages of forced disappearance: the initial armed stage of physical violence, of submitting the students and taking them to an unknown destination, using all sorts of apparatus and instruments and infrastructure of the state, police vehicles and highways and federal roadblocks and so forth. And then very importantly, what I think of as the administrative stage of forced disappearance, which is the way the state uses its lawyers and its scientists and computers and press conferences and legal documents to produce the disappearance by initially the creation of an entirely fabricated scenario, a false scene, a place where we now know nothing happened, and a narrative which didn't correspond to the actual events, which was then thrust by the state with all the power of the state upon the families and upon the nation, upon the world, to, I think, make it impossible to actually find them and to be able to map and discover the full chain of events and chain of command involved in disappearing them. So this administrative stage of forced disappearance, carried out initially by the Enrique Peña Nieto administration of the PRI, which was just this, over-the-top, ridiculous, offensive operation of state violence, of lies and torture, and invention of false scenarios. With the new and current administration led by Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the situation has changed. And the Ayotzinapa, the forced disappearance of the 43 Ayotzinapa students is actually the only, to use, for want of a better term, kind of case of a human rights violation that the Mexican state has made an explicit commitment to investigate. And this after 15 some years of a state narco terror war that has left some 200,000 people murdered and more than 79,000 forcibly disappeared using official numbers. So, I mean, a nation that is still in the throes of an overwhelmingly traumatic campaign of state terror, and this new administration is making an explicit commitment to investigate one event. And in so doing, so far, they've mostly focused on locating remains. And to date, they have located remains of two students from the school at a location distinct from the location that was insisted upon by the previous government, and thus, becoming further evidence to debunk the entire weight of the previous administration's lies and attempt to create a false scenario. The several things that I talk about briefly about this new administration is that their discursive acts are constantly attempting, I think, to delegitimize, to minimize any kind of non-state actors' search for truth and search for facts and search for the students themselves. And there's these constant iterations through official state events commemorating the attacks against the students, where state agents, including the president and the officials now in charge of the investigation, state straight out that only state-sanctioned knowledge can be really considered knowledge. And that they're famously, the current subsecretary for human rights, the Mexican federal government, Alejandro Encinas, said at several presentations about the investigation they were about to begin, la única verdad en el caso de Ayotzinapa es que todavía no hay verdad, right? The only truth in the Ayotzinapa case is that there is still no truth. And he said this about, I think, one of the most exhaustively documented mass state atrocities in contemporary times. There is an amazing amount of truth, much of which, perhaps the core of which, has been produced by the survivors themselves, as well as by the families who have been looking from their sons from within minutes of hearing of what was happening to them. And so there's this tension between the state proclaiming to investigate, but then also engaging in all sorts of what I think of as discursive violence, saying that only when the state announces that it has found something is it truly found. That on the one hand, and then briefly also the relationship of the new administration to armed forces creates another one of these tensions, because the role of the Mexican armed forces in the events on September 26, 27, 2014, when 6 people were murdered, scores of people were injured, and 43 students disappeared, is one of the central key features of understanding what happened to the students and what is continuing to happen, and what that event, that attack and mass forced disappearance actually reveals about the state of narco state terror in that region and in the country. And the current president, López Obrador, has made it incredibly clear that he is supporting the armed forces, and not only supporting them, but actually giving them more power, still more power than really any administration in recent Mexican history. And that's just an attempt to do that very quickly.
Thanks, John. Jeline, do you want to jump in?
Hi. Good. A pleasant good afternoon to everyone. And let me say as well, thank you to Heather and everybody at NACLA for accepting my paper and for giving me the opportunity to share on this platform. All right, so the title of my paper was Toppling the Colonizers at UE, and the article examines the reasons for and the process by which the oldest student accommodation at the University of the West Indies, UE, at St. Augustine, located in Trinidad, had a name change after almost 100 years, from Milner Hall to Freedom Hall. The change took place on the 20th of February, 2018. So who was Milner, and why was the hall named after him in the first place? Lord or Viscount Alfred Milner was a prominent administrator in the British Empire. He was High Commissioner and Governor in Cape Colony in present-day South Africa. And with regard to the West Indies, he held a very important position of Secretary of State for the Colonies in the immediate post-World War I period from 1919 to 1921. In his capacity as Secretary of State for the Colonies, Milner chaired a 1990 committee which established the West Indian College of Agriculture, which in 1924 was renamed the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture, which is the forerunner of the present-day existing University of the West Indies. To honor Milner's critical role in the establishment of the first tertiary level academic institution in the region, the Caribbean region, in 1927, 2 years after his death, the board of ITCA, the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture, agreed to name the student accommodation after Milner. So why then, in the 21st century, did Milner's name come under attack? Sir Hilary Beckles, who is the current Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies and Chairman of the CARICOM Reparation Commission, spearheaded the movement to expunge Milner's name from UWI. Beckles confessed that prior to 2015, he was oblivious to the crimes against humanity of which Milner was guilty. However, his perspective changed as a result of teaching engagements in the University of Johannesburg, as well as his participation in a conference, as well as in the University of Johannesburg in 2015 and 2017. Supported by the careful research of Pro-Vice Chancellor Alan Cubley, who is located at the Cave Hill campus, located on the island of Barbados, and Alan Cubley is a specialist in South African history. Beckles was adamant that the racist imperialists who formulated theories describing people of African descent as savages, and who was also a founder of the criminal and inhumane system of apartheid, which was in existence in South Africa till about the 1990s, insisted that it was antithetical to the vision and the mission of UWI to continue to emblazon the name of Alfred Milner at the premier academic institution of the region. With Milner's imperialist worldview out in the open, Beckles, as one of the chief defenders of the 10-point plan of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, insisted that the name had to be removed, especially in light of the 4th point of that CRJP, or the CARICOM Reparations Justice Program. That 4th point, which called for a program with the establishment of museums and community spaces where people of African descent can be better educated about Europeans' contribution to the genocide of the first peoples of the region, as well as their involvement in slavery and the trade in captured Africans. So that kind of setting and that mission of CARICOM and the reparations movement, Beckles insisted that Milner's name had to go. Not even Milner's contribution to education in the region was strong enough to shield him from the attack to which he was exposed at the UWI in 2017. The research of Professor Emerita of History, Bridget Brereton, reveals that Milner's view on education was confined within the parameters of inequality, colonial privilege, superiority, and racism. The administrators and staff of ITCA, all of whom were white and all of whom were British, as well as the curriculum, which was strictly limited to tropical agriculture, shaped by the objective that once the white graduates, British students, had completed their programs, they would be posted to various parts of the British Empire, and they would supervise agricultural production on lands that were confiscated from locals. And consequently, the college that Milner helped to direct in Trinidad and the rest of the region did not prioritize the need of the development of the people of the region. The attack on Milner at UE also reverberated alongside protest movements in other parts of the world, which rejected the continued glorification of known perpetrators of genocidal oppression and racial terror, such as the 2015 Rhodes Must Fall movement, which was responsible for pulling down the statue of Cecil Rhodes at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement, which recently reignited in the United States, but had rippling effects in different parts of the world, including in Bristol, where the statue of former trader in captured Africans, Edward Colston, who was born in Bristol, was toppled in 2020 and thrown into the river in Bristol. With regards to the process by which the decision to remove the name is concerned, all stakeholders of the UE, represented by the Finance and General Purposes Committee, were given the opportunity to voice their views on the matter. The campus principal, Pro Vice Chancellor Brian Copeland, and Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education, who was also a former supervisor of Milner Hall, Dr. Heather Cato, chaired a series of town meetings to which students, former and present residents of Milner Hall, the general public, and there was a particular interest from a group called Crossroads Freedom Project, an organization committed to the critical examination of the colonial past with the view of creating a truly emancipated Caribbean society. They were all invited and shared their views. Many of the students were persuaded, based on the research done by Alan Cubley from Barbados, that it was difficult to justify or to defend or to continue to defend using the name of Milner on the oldest student accommodation at the UE. Some others, however, were torn by sentimental values, attachment to the whole, and it was a little more difficult for them to sever ties with the Milner name. In the end, however, the appeal to repudiate the colonial mentality and to embrace instead true emancipation prevailed. And the students' decision to change Milner Hall to Freedom Hall was unanimously adopted.
That's great.
The movement, just about two more things. The movement to remove Milner divided the wider national community into two distinct camps. One support while arguing or warning against cancel culture, and the second used the Milner issue as a reference or a stepping stone to question the appropriateness of continuing to honor other malefactors of the colonial past, such as Christopher Columbus. In closing, replacing Milner Hall with the name Freedom Hall represented a significant achievement of a formerly colonized people, not wanting to change their past. I mean, that is a futile undertaking, but to change their response to the past by bringing it into alignment with the acquisition of independence and appreciation for what is just and beneficial to Caribbean people and society. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynette. I mean, people can hear me right now. I'm on.
Yes.
You know, just these essays fit together so well because they're really, they really go in different directions and open up to different ways in which memory and history relate to each other in very different contexts. On the one hand, you have the Chilean case, which is the most hopeful in some ways. I mean, as is the University of West Indies, but the Chilean case, this mass movement in which memory, it's not just the memory that we've been handed down, according to Manuela, from neoliberalism and all, but it's even opening up, right, to in a society that actually hasn't grappled much with it being a conquest society, settled colonial society, to this wide open movement. And then you have the case of Guatemala, which is constantly mobilized and overwhelmingly oppressive, right? And just it's just and again, memory is central, but then it seems like that it's a constant slog, when you never get to the point where you see the kind of optimism and opening up of Chile, and then you have the forensic memory of what's going on in Mexico around the case of the 43, and then the Anglo case, and which opens up to the Anglo world. And you mentioned cancel culture and and these struggles over symbolism. I don't know are there any? I don't know the answer to this, but it doesn't seem to me that there's a big movement within Spanish American nations, social movements around renaming. Maybe there is, but I guess now that I think about it, I guess I remember different, I think that, they've renamed streets after, conquista from a way who, what that were named after conquistadores, but not the kind of focus. It seems to be subordinated to a larger movement in which the terms of the debate within Anglo society about symbolism and cancel culture just don't have traction. I don't know, maybe that's something we could throw out. The other thing I was thinking about, and I mentioned this in an email that I sent to everybody, I remember reading Tom Klubak's review of Patricio Guzman's Obstinate Memory in NACLA, just to give another plug for NACLA, and it's a great review. And Obstinate Memory is a great movie to teach. And I, presuming a lot of people here know that it's the movie that kind of reassesses his classic battle for Chile, and it has a thesis, and the thesis is that neoliberalism has won. It was a fight over consciousness, and it was a fight over silence and reconfiguring what subjectivity is and what it means to be a citizenship. And neoliberalism has, and the violence has terrorized people into forgetting. And obviously that thesis is not true. That in retrospect, from what, it's a great documentary, but its thesis was falsified in many ways by what's happened in Chile. So I don't know, I just thought I'd throw that out there, and if anybody wants to pick up any of the thoughts or engage with one another on any of the points that they've made.
Yeah, I would like to jump on that last comment, Greg, because I really like it, actually. And I think, I don't know if Patricio Guzman and his thesis was actually wrong, but I think one of the... I was just
emphasizing.
Yeah, I know that. But one of the things that, for me, at least, has been extremely important to work with this idea of memory and collective memory, right, is that, as the Argentinian sociologist Elizabeth Yellin, she said, memory it can be a sociological concept, but at the same time it's a social category. And as such, it has the capacity of express, is something that is happening in the present, right? And Chile has changed in that sense, and probably as far as I know, Patricio Guzman was also making a documentary right now about the uprising. So probably he will end up with a refreshing reflection on that. But I'm pretty sure that Chilean society has changed deeply. And in that sense, and this is also a question maybe for all of you, and especially for Jelene, what is the role of the new generations of these, of these changes? And I think that in my view, at least in Chile, since 2011, in which we had this very strong student movement, the memory realm, to call it like in that way, start like being shaped all the time. And I think that's if we try to look for a landmark, that event opened a new stage for memory. And of course, 10 years later, like 2019, 2020, and probably with the inauguration of the Constitutional Assembly, we will have like the end of this cycle, and we will probably start talking very differently about memory in 2 more years in Chile. I think that's my idea, because I think something is going to change in a very impressive way, you know, in the sense that many of those things that Patricio Guzman described it as being in olvidadas, right, or silence, have been right now put in the very línea del frente or primera línea, like in the front line. So yeah.
Yeah. And I also like your opening, I say with Piñera's, I mean, he wanted to have a ministry of the future. Or, I mean, it's such a neoliberal, like the idea that there's too much remembering, there's too much history, there's too much memory. You know, you can, I mean, this is a central premise in many ways of not just conservatives, but neoliberals and liberals, that, you know, you have to move on. You can't keep adjudicating the past, because there'll never ever be a resolution. And if we have going to have any kind of functioning polity, we have to move on. But obviously that's not possible for many reasons in Latin America. Carlos, I wanted to ask about the Haverford project is really terrific. It's going to be an amazing resource, and it's inspirational that GOM denuncias are going to be available. And I thought you and your co-authors did a wonderful job in laying out the difficulties, and, you know, especially around, you know, the line between victim and perpetrator, and which is which, and when it comes to delineating what information is available. But I was just wondering, maybe if you could, there's a lot going, obviously there's so much going on in Guatemala. There's this constant sense of urgency and crisis that in some ways swamps and overwhelms these struggles to archive and document and to institutionalize these incredible archives that have been found in Guatemala, you know, and I know there's, you know, the police dossier, the military dossier, the police archives. But what is this? What's the status of the moment of the police archive? I know NACLA has done a lot of work on the police archive since its unexpected discovery in that car lot. Where did you go? Oh, there you are. Could you say a few words of where things stand now? I think maybe NACLA readers might be interested. It's odd. It's often odd. It's constantly under siege, but it's always fun to. Is it not accessible? Is it really just withering away? Are they really just going? Is it really just ready to be drowned in bathwater?
Thank you, Greg. I think that it's important for us to be clear about what the archive of the police means for Guatemala. I think that this is an archive that appeared in 2005, and suddenly for over 30, 40 years, people said, the government said, police has never had any archive, so you can't access to any information about that. But this archive appeared in an accidental way. They thought that it was a place that it was going to explode, and when they went to see, they saw that there were 80 million of documents. Just, you can realize that 80 million of documents. And I think that the work of the organizations, human rights organizations, and the ombudsman on that moment was to, we need to guard this place. We need to be aware of what's going on, and international community were able to support the functioning of this place. But for me, I think that the appearance of the National Police Archive is the break point for transitional justice in Guatemala. When they start working these documents, I'm talking about 2005, in 2008, we had the first transitional justice case in court. It allowed it to take on trial to all these former military that were the ones who, the perpetrators of this crime, war crime. So I think that for us, this was the pike. It was 2008, 9 until 2013. When the genocide trial came out, it was the break point in the country. The country was divided between the people who said in Guatemala there was never a genocide, and the people who said in Guatemala there was a genocide. But why is this a breakpoint for the country? Because the private sector, all these people who had the money in Guatemala, we all know that the army guard their goods, their all their money that they have. So the private sector made a huge campaign in order to say, in Guatemala, we are not genocides. And that moment was key for all the things that came over in against the National Police Archive, because in that moment, they saw that this was a great tool for justice, for victims to get justice. What happened? There were the last three governments are made their best efforts to close the National Police Archive, and this moment is the worst moment for transitional justice and the archive, because right now the government has all the control of the archive, and there are almost anyone giving access to information. The personnel is just, there are only 2 or 3 people that are giving information, but they can say to you, we don't have that information.
And all that, just a quick question, because I think maybe we should start going. Alejandro has a good question. That'll be a good way to open it up to questions. But after all of these years, all of that digitization, none of that is available. It's not accessible. There's no, I mean, who's in charge of all of the digitization? There was a lot of electronic work, and just quickly, that's not available. Researchers don't have access to that.
If you can figure it out how to understand the software that they made to be able to be on the website, you are going to be able to access, but it is nothing accessible. I'm saying that in this moment, there are no money for people to work in the archive, and there are no money for the software, for give the necessary maintenance that they need to give access to information. So that is why efforts like the GAM archive and the alliances of institutions as Haverford are so important, because public archives are no longer to be available, and we are not going to have access. That is why private archives that contains information about human rights violations are key to keep in mind the work of giving dignity to the victims and making their history alive, their memory alive.
Yeah. Alejandro, who makes NACLA, along with Heather, makes NACLA possible, has a good question, and might be a good way to kind of opening up to audience questions. So yes, I think Heather told people to share questions, but Alejandro's question, I'm sure everybody can see it. It's posted to the whole group, but it's to all of the people. So anybody wants to jump in, but what is there something about this moment in particular? Because again, Latin America, I mean, you know, in 1967, somebody wrote a novel about about control over memory being key to creating the national popula. And so it's an ongoing thing in Latin America. But is there something particular about this moment? And then importantly, and I think Alejandro's second point might be the answer to the question, the right seems to be making its own history claims, right, in different ways. The more mobilized culturalist, into US maybe influenced culturalist right, which is a fairly new phenomenon, has its own understandings of history and what the relationship between those two things are. Maybe it would be good if anybody wants to answer that question.
Well, I could say that certainly the decision to change Milner's name did not happen in isolation. All right. As I mentioned in the paper, developing the paper is reverberated within the context of other protest movements around the world, led by some young people, but by older ones as well. The Black Lives Matter movement, even in the Caribbean, the Reparation Commission kind of fed that decision that, listen, when we re-examine our colonial past and our colonial legacy, should we really be paying respect and giving honor to a man who had no regard for and no concern about the development of Caribbean people and Caribbean society? No. So that it didn't just happen out of the blue and in isolation. Alejandro is correct, it happened within a wider context. And two that I can identify immediately are the Caribbean Reparation Movement, which was officially launched in 2013, as well as the wider from the USA Black Lives Movement, which had ripples around the world.
Yeah, I also would like, I mean, thank you, Alejandro, for that. I think it's a really key question right now. It's difficult though, because it kind of make us to think about difficult stuff that are happening also, and that don't necessarily would like to talk that much about that, but it's important and it's happening, and it's happening fast. So just to comment on that, I would like to mention that since 2019 also, along with these other eruptions of memory, right, the colonial one or the more like recent post-dictatorship one, we also have sort of counter movement type of memory eruptions. So we have a wave, and we are actually working on an article about this with my colleague and friend Carolina Aguilera, about the attacks to human rights memorials across Chile. So in less than 2 months, more than 20 human rights memorials that were they were built. It was a huge effort, you know, from organizations of victims, and because the state, of course, refused to do that at the beginning of the post-dictatorship era. But then suddenly, and just in between all these conflicts, we also have those expressions, right? So that we can read, of course, as a claiming of memory from the right. The vandalizations were graffitis mostly, but also like excrements and very like hateful type of discourse, like on top of those memorials that basically are honoring the victims of the dictatorship. So it's something that is there, and the question of Alexandro, I mean the why question, I think it's difficult to answer in one way, but I think there is a moral contest there, right? So it seems that we have been building this memory of the good, you know, of the victims, that is also like being challenged somehow, at least in Chile. And in that expansion of what memory means, right-wing and far right-wing organizations and groups have also, you know, claim their part, which is something that is one of the main problems, I would say, of the memory concept. So, but I just want to give that example because I think it's like really like peculiar and really difficult to handle.
Yeah. No, since nobody else has posted a question, I'll just say, I think many ways John's essay is very much along the lines of this question. I mean, AMLO is a very particular formation, the coalition he represents, the history he invokes, the restraints he operates in, and I think that you lay out a good example of this is a different kind of moment for this kind of memory, mobilization around memories, around atrocities in a country that, there's obviously difficulties, and it doesn't seem from what you're saying is that there's many, it doesn't, my reading is that there's not a lot of, it doesn't lead more of an opening. It leads more of to an estrangement and an alienation of popular groups who are left with their own memory building and history making without any hope from the state, or in the state is this kind of uncanny figure of a vestige of the left, but not somebody they could dismiss. I don't know. It just seems to be that your essay speaks to Alejandro's question to some degree.
I think AMLO, in many ways, he builds himself up as this figure of revolution, announces his administration is nothing less than the fourth transformation of the country, and with a lot of, kinds of discourse of the left in terms of opposing corruption and seeking justice for former presidents and economic justice issues. But in so many ways, he's immensely conservative, and precisely when it comes to talking about crimes of the past, he even uses the kind of language in the second part of Alejandro's question about, no, it's time to move on. Not very different from the way that Peña Nieto initially responded to the disappearance of the students when, just a few months after, when they announced the false theory built on torture and lies, and he literally said, get over it, just like the nation needs to move on, get over it. And AMLO does a lot of that, especially in his relationship to the armed forces, where he doesn't want to talk about, an entrenched legacy of systematic violence carried out through the armed forces, but says that the armed forces are the people in uniform, and since he's the president now, they can be trusted and things like that.
Greg, I just I'm seeing the last question, and I would like to say something about it.
Yes, from Patrick. I think it's from Patrick, Tim, and Jess.
Yeah, I think it is great, the question, because that is something that we have been talking about with Haverford people, because our project, for example, we all know about the role of United States in the civil war in Guatemala. So right now, what we are trying to do is to give information to the young people that is starting to investigate, and they need to end with the discussion about left and right and Cold War. They need to have more information about anything, about what happened in Guatemala, about the victims, about the role of any country. So I think that it is a moment for us to speak about what happened, what was the role of the United States in Guatemala, for example, and that people that are investigating about Guatemala and South United States, they need to know what are the responsibilities that any country has in this kind of events that are tragic. But we are trying to give this information to all the people that wants to be able to know the perception of a victim, because the testimonies that we had, you can make a great link between the information that are in the police archive, between the information they gave in that moment. You have the perspective of the victim, and you can have in one document of the police, you can have the perspective of the perpetrators. So I think that it is very important to be able to have access to all the information that you can give to the people. That is the only way to generate better better analysis.
Yeah. And there's NACLA. There is NACLA. NACLA's been doing this for, over 50 years. And there is, there is something structurally ingrained about the inability to think about Latin America. And Latin America is the mechanism by which the United States doesn't think about empire more broadly. The way the way foreign policy is erased from social justice struggles in the United States, except for people who are specifically concerned about it. It's amazing, and there's a long history for that. I was just reading some Adolf Burrow was the Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America, and I was reading his memoir, and he talked about being at a Georgetown dinner party, and he was sitting next to Walter Lippmann, the journalist and writer, and Walter Lippmann's wife. He didn't identify his wife's name, so I'm not sure, but Walter Lippmann and his wife, and he just started talking about Latin America, and they just looked at him and said, "We don't care about Latin America." that was the end of the conversation. And so this is deep. Anybody else want to oh, here's a specific question from Judy for John Gibler. Where did it go? It's jumping around. Do you want? I could read it. Do I need to read it out loud? People are reading these, right? AMLO appears to fall in the same category as a figure like Lula, without posing himself as a centrist, and manages to call forth very strong criticism of both right and left. Could you comment on that?
He somewhat falls into the same category, but I think with very unique particularities. He's a fierce nationalist. And I think he's completely, this is just my opinion, but I think he's completely obsessed with his perception as a great president. On his speech on election night when the opponents conceded and he gave his victory speech in the Zocalo in Mexico City, he repeated, I forget how many times, 3, 4, 5, my ambition is to go down in history as a great president of Mexico. So here's someone else who's also very concerned about memory, but in this case, his own, right? In his own, in a historical context. And I mean, on the one hand, he does face a very real opposition from entrenched power elites within Mexico, and some of whom are still, operating within the structure of the state, of course. But it's a very strange opposition again, because he has made the armed forces his very close ally in his self-proclaimed fourth transformation of the nation. So he's, done unprecedented things towards the militarization of the nation. And just from my own personal experience of doing human rights work in Mexico in the late 1990s, militarization was an intense part of everyday social movements and indigenous struggles all over the country. And that's almost been just completely eviscerated. Like, the militarization's just done. It's just an everyday fact of life in the country. And over the past, 15 or so years of a so-called drug war. And AMLO has actually been able to push that ever further, granting the army direct control over national infrastructure projects like trains and airports, giving them the direct construction responsibilities and contracts and administration of these projects, and of course, creating a national militarized police force. He's a very strange figure out, he somewhat fits into the category of you know, Lula, Chavez, Evo Morales, but also he sticks out of it.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that the AMLO would be Lula if Mexico didn't share a 200-year history with the 2,000-mile border with the United States. If it was 1,000 miles further to the south, then maybe AMLO would be Lula. There's a variable there that is a little bit overdetermined. There's a question for Carlos from Eric Paul. What kinds of forums do you work transmitting history to your younger folks?
Yeah, well, I guess that what we are trying to do is to convert all these documents, all these testimonies in products that can be attractive to young people in Guatemala, because that is why all of us are warriors against forgetting, because we need to face a huge efforts of forgetting, because right now the public university is the only one that gives information about the historical memory, about the internal armed conflict. So you need to face a lot of young people that doesn't even know what happened in Guatemala during the Civil War. So that is why we are working in convert all these documents in multimedia products that can be able to generate sensitivity with the victims, and to say this is what happened. What the case of Edgar Fernando Garcia, a union worker, he was disappeared at the age of 24 years old. So we're trying to convert all these testimonies, all these stories in products that can generate a dialogue between the people who is seeing this and say, what were you doing at your 20s? These people was suffering about a lot of attacks from governments, from dictatorships. So I think that is one of the ways that we are trying to give access to information for young people, because in this moment in Guatemala, there are a lot of interest of this kind of subject, because governments in the past have been huge efforts to place the forgetting in our society.
Jillian, do you see Heather's question here?
Yes, I see her question, so I'll respond. And yes, I did mention the calls for the pulling down of the statue of Christopher Columbus in the capital city of Port of Spain. And she asked about whether there were other names and monuments attracting scrutiny. One other one that definitely comes to mind is the names of streets in Woodbrook, which is a suburban area outside of Port of Spain. And these street names were derived from war heroes, in quotation marks, of people who fought in the same Boer War, BOER, that Milner helped to kind of spark in South Africa just before he became governor of Cape Colony, right? Reginald Dumas, who is the former head of the public service in Trinidad and Tobago, following the Milner issue and the discussion and the decision to change the name, did call for the change of those names, because he sees it as a continued glorification of people who were definitely guilty of crimes against humanity, and yet still in Trinidad and Tobago, they are honored by these street signs. So these streets in Woodbrook, there's been a call to pull that down, and certainly the Christopher Columbus statue. I need to mention too, she talked about the initiation, the impetus rather, to change from Milner Hall to Freedom Hall came within the institution. I kind of piggybacking to some extent on what Manuela suggested about young people's involvement. It wasn't so much that the students took the initiative to change the name. It actually came from the Vice Chancellor, Sir Hilary Beckles, and he put it forward to the Finance and General Purpose Committee that, listen, something has to be done here. And that's how the students were invited, almost led to consider the need to make this change. Yeah.
Let's see, there's one message. Here's a question for John. News recently came out that the remains of another student have been identified conclusively, again countering the previous government's historical truths. What you're thinking about what you said about AMLO's government's discursive violence, what has been the government's narrative around these latest events?
Sure. Just also before I forget, in relation to the conversation about monuments, I was thinking about how on October 12th, 1992, indigenous protesters in San Cristóbal de las Casas, Chiapas, knocked down the statue of Diego de Mazariegos. And so here, and this was, others could confirm, but largely thought about as a public peaceful protest that was a kind of dress rehearsal for the January 1, 1994 Zapatista invasion of San Cristóbal, that a lot of the people involved in that invasion carried out this public march as, or no, I shouldn't say invasion, that's the wrong word. It would be the retaking, right? The retaking of San Cristóbal by the Zapatistas on January 1st. So the recent announcement by the Mexican government in relation to the Ayotzinapa case, there was another 2 remains that were identified from remains that have been taken from a site that we mentioned in the article that is 800 meters away from the trash dump that the previous administration had said was the location of the mass incineration of the 43 students. And it's a very complex issue where the location of the site actually came through testimony of one of the people implicated and definitely involved in the mass forced disappearance, who was initially tortured and tried and sentenced under the false narrative. And so after the change, several years later, a judge threw out that conviction because it was proven to have been based on torture, and then of course even further proven to have been related to this narrative that everybody now knows wasn't the case. And so this person has come back knowing that sooner or later they would be tried again for what they really did, and tried to offer testimony to reduce their sentence, and thus created a narrative that combines truth and lies, which is a very slippery document, which unfortunately the current administration, following a long tradition of state practice, leaked this document, legal document, which is this person's supposed confession, now offered voluntarily, to the press. And the press just pretty much reprinted it without any kind of investigation or commentary or criticism of the document, thus putting out, on front pages and so on, another version that is completely enmeshed in a weaving of truth and lie, and very insidious lies that recast the logic of the attacks, and again constantly try to move scrutiny away from the armed forces and from the federal forces. And so the government, at least give credit where it's due. One thing different about this administration is that when they have the results of these forensic analysis tests, the first thing they do is they go with human rights workers accompanying them, seek out the families and let the families know first, which is what the previous administration did not do. What they did was hold a press conference, right? And so imagine having to hear things like that on TV or radio news. And so at least they have done that. And then when they release publicly the information, they're very technical, and they're very careful about just talking about the location of the remains, the identification of the remains. They reinforce or restate that this finding is just further evidence that disproves the previous administration's lies, but they have not yet put forth any kind of a story based on investigation as to what happened, as to the logic of the attacks, as to the chain of command that night. And given that the previous administration's state lies have had so many years to fester, when information like this comes out from the state that's reduced or limited to only the technical finding, I feel that, or I worry that it comes out into this completely tarnished context of truth and lies all mixed together and continues to do damage because there is still not only no official account of the true nature of the state involvement in these attacks, but the contemporary state still does these tricks, like I said at the beginning, of trying to say that all the independent investigations that have taken place, which have been incredibly varied and incredibly exhaustive and important, and even more importantly, the survivors' testimonies and the families' experiences and their own investigations, they're all kind of knocked out of center by the state's obsession with announcing only what it finds will be the truth.
That's great, John. I'm getting the signal that it's time to wrap up. So, it is interesting, the Christopher Columbus thing, because this has been going on in Latin America for a long time, right? I mean, we think of the toppling of statues here in the United States or in the transatlantic Anglo world, Rhodes must fall as a relatively new phenomenon. And I guess you can go back over a decade and they had that great Sopranos episode where they were defending Columbus Day Parade. But it seems to me that Columbus has been toppled in Latin America for quite a long time, and I don't know. It's an interesting question. We don't have time to go into it here, but to the degree to which that kind of the sharp kind of politics around these symbols in Latin America. I mean, yes, like I think in Argentina, when the Kirchner government assumed responsibility for I don't know if they called it a genocide, but the war, the atrocities of the War of the Desert in the 1870s. I think they changed the name of a street that was named after the general who carried out that campaign, Julio Roca. So I think there's been name changes and things like that. But I just wonder if to some degree, because of the power of social movements in Latin America, and because memory is actually deeper in some ways and more vital, that the kind of politics that we see in the Anglo world around quote unquote cancel culture or name changing just doesn't have the same kind of resonance because as we, just the ongoing struggle about real memory, about victims, about, real cancel culture, the disappearances, is just so much more of a vital part of the left political culture in Latin America. I don't know, but I've gotten the signal that we're finished. So I just want to thank Carlos and Manuela and Jillian and John for a great panel, and thank Heather for inviting me to be the moderator. And I don't know, is that it? Do we just say goodbye?
I'll just pop on to quickly say
Okay.
thank you again to Greg, and thank you to Jillian, Carlos, Manuela, and John. It was so great to hear from you and just continue the discussion. So thank you so much, and thanks to all of our attendees for joining us. We have been recording this conversation, so if any of your friends missed it and want to check it out, we'll upload it on YouTube afterwards, and you can find it there. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Ciao, muchas gracias.
Bye.